My name is Meredith. I'm 34 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I'm going to tell you about an experience I had 6 years ago. I still can't quite explain what happened, but honestly, I can't forget it. The feeling I had that day still lingers, like a buzz in the back of my mind. It all started on a Sunday afternoon. I was visiting a little town called Silver Falls, about an hour away from where I lived at the time. It was a small place, with a few main streets and that small town vibe where time seems to move slower. After spending the day exploring trails, I decided to grab lunch before heading back home. I found a restaurant that looked promising, with an old sign that said Willow Diner in faded letters. It looked like something out of a 60s movie. I walked in, thinking I'd grab something quick. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt something weird, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was a typical diner, with those red leather booths and a wooden counter, nothing that stood out right away. The place was almost empty, except for an elderly woman at one of the booths, sipping coffee, and a couple sitting at the far end. But there was something in the air, an unsettling vibe that seemed to come from every corner. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just sat by a window and picked up the menu. As I was scanning the options, I started to notice something strange. A soft music was playing in the background, something instrumental with a piano, very faint and almost imperceptible. I only noticed because there was complete silence between the few customers. I thought it was a little odd, but I figured it was just the restaurant's sound system. I chose a burger and called the waitress, a young woman, probably in her 20s, with a smile that seemed almost automatic. When she came to take my order, I casually asked what song was playing. She looked at me like I had asked the weirdest question in the world. Music? We don't have background music here, she said, laughing as if I was joking. That left me a little embarrassed, so I just nodded and went on with my meal. But I knew I could hear it. There was music, faint but there, and it wasn't coming from anywhere obvious. As I waited for my order, I kept paying closer attention. There were no visible speakers anywhere in the restaurant. Nothing in the corners, nothing in the ceiling. Just the music, which seemed to be there but coming from nowhere. It was like the sound was in the air, diffuse. And it wasn't just any music. There was something about it that made me uneasy. It was beautiful, but in a way that bothered me, like there was a sadness behind every note. It made me look around, trying to see if anyone else noticed. The elderly woman with the coffee seemed unaware, and the couple was talking quietly, not seeming to hear anything. When the waitress came back with my order, I asked again, this time more directly. "Are you sure there's no background music? I swear I can hear something." She paused for a second, like she was trying to understand what I was saying. Then she shrugged and said, "No, we really don't have anything like that. Maybe you're hearing something from outside?" I knew it wasn't from outside. The restaurant was closed in, and all I could hear from the outside was the sound of cars passing. But again, I decided not to push it. I just thanked her and continued eating. The music didn't stop, and the more I paid attention, the more it seemed to get just a little bit louder, but never enough to be uncomfortable. It was like it was adjusted just enough to be noticed, but not enough to distract. I started to feel a growing unease, a sense that something wasn't quite right. My gaze wandered around the place, and that's when I noticed something else odd. All the employees had the same forced smile, almost robotic, as if they were just going through the motions. Their interactions were minimal, almost non-existent. I finished my meal quickly. I didn't want to be there anymore. I paid the check and was about to leave when I decided to ask another employee about the music. It was a middle-aged man, probably the manager, standing by the counter. I went up to him and asked, "Do you know where the music is coming from? I swear I can hear it." He looked at me for a moment, and for the first time, I saw something different in his eyes. His smile disappeared for a second, and it seemed like he was going to say something. But then he smiled again, that same uncomfortable smile, and replied, "Sorry, but we don't have any music here. Must be in your head." That made me even more nervous. I left the restaurant without looking back. On the way to my car, the music still seemed to follow me, like it had stuck to my mind. I drove as fast as I could to get out of that town, trying to forget everything. But You know, the weirdest thing happened that night when I got home. As soon as I stepped into my apartment, I swear I could hear, very softly, the same piano playing. I stood still for a moment, trying to figure out if it was real or just in my head. Since then, I've never gone back to Silver Falls, and I avoid that area. I still don't know what that was. I looked up the restaurant online, but nothing came up as strange. It's just a regular diner, at least on paper. But that music, even now, it seems like I can hear it in moments of absolute silence. I can't explain it. I just know I never wanted to go through something like that again. My name is Paige Larkins. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. I want to share something that happened to me a few years ago when I worked as a manager at a restaurant here in the city. The place closed not long ago, but what happened there still scares me, and to this day, I can't find an explanation. I started working at the restaurant in 2015. The place was charming, one of those with rustic decor, you know? Dark wooden furniture, warm yellowish pendant lights, and a cozy, comfortable refuge vibe that attracted a lot of couples and families. The restaurant wasn't huge, but it had an upstairs with reserved tables and a view of the main street. It seemed like a normal place, up to a point. But over time, strange things started happening that just didn't make sense. The first time I noticed something odd was when a customer came up to me complaining about a distasteful joke. He showed me a photo he took with his phone while dining with his wife. It was a picture of them smiling, but in the background, there was a woman standing between the tables, staring directly at the camera. She was wearing a black dress, somewhat old-fashioned, and her face, I can't even describe it properly. It was like it was out of focus, but not because of a problem with the camera, you know? It looked blurred, like a melting painting. The problem? The restaurant was almost empty that night, and the table where she seemed to be standing had no one on it. I felt uncomfortable, of course, but I thought it was just some weird reflection or a mistake with the phone's focus. I apologized to the customer and didn't think much more about it. But it didn't stop there. The following week, another customer came up to me, pale-faced. She had taken a picture of her husband and daughter to post on Instagram, but in the background, you could clearly see what appeared to be a man sitting at one of the tables with his back to them. He was wearing a fedora hat, like the old-fashioned ones, and seemed to be looking directly at them over his shoulder. The problem was the same. That part of the restaurant was completely empty. After that, things started to escalate. I started receiving more and more similar complaints. It was always pictures taken inside the restaurant, and there would always be faces or figures in the background. The most bizarre part was that none of them seemed to belong to actual customers. One day, a group of friends who were celebrating a birthday brought a professional camera and took several photos. All of them were normal, except for one. In that photo, there were at least 5 faces floating in the background, hovering in the air, all blurred and staring in the same direction. I saw the photo with my own eyes. It was like they were reflections in the glass, except there was no glass in that direction. I even tried to find a logical explanation. I called a technician to check the security cameras, thinking maybe there was something with the lighting system or a reflection from the lamps. But nothing could explain what was happening. When we reviewed the footage from the security cameras, there was never anyone where the photos showed the figures. The restaurant was cleaned regularly, so there was no dust or dirt that could cause this kind of illusion. The peak of all this happened on a Monday when the restaurant was closed to the public. I was taking pictures to update the restaurant's website because we were renewing the menu. I took about 10 photos of the empty dining room, just to capture the angles of the tables and the decor. When I went to review them on my phone, in at least half of them, there were people I had never seen before. In one of the photos, there was an entire group sitting at a table in the corner. They were all smiling and looking directly at the camera, but the table they were at wasn't even set, you know? There were no utensils, glasses, nothing. It was just empty. At that moment, I felt something that I can't explain. It was like the air had become heavier, like someone was watching me. I looked around, but I was alone. I didn't need anything else to decide I wasn't staying there much longer. I asked the restaurant owner if I could switch to a different shift, and luckily he agreed. I left the place a few weeks later, but before that, something happened that made me question my sanity. A colleague, Kelly, took a picture of me and her on our last day working together. It was a selfie, taken in the kitchen, with no one else around. When she showed me the photo, my heart almost stopped. Right behind me, next to the pantry door, there was the face of a child. Just the face. And it wasn't a smiling child or anything like that. It was a serious face, empty, with a gaze that seemed to pierce through you. The pantry, at that moment, was locked. After I left the restaurant, I made sure to keep up with the local news to see if anything came up about the place. A year later, it shut down. The official reason was low business, but I can't help but think it had something to do with that. One time I decided to search online to see if I could find any information about what that place was before it became a restaurant. I discovered that in the 1940s, that building was used as a boarding house. I didn't find specific details, but a few mentions talked about disappearances and suspicious activities. I never managed to confirm anything, but that was enough to give me the chills. To this day, I avoid passing in front of that place. They opened a clothing store there recently, and every time I see someone entering or leaving, I wonder if strange things still happen. I don't have the courage to find out, and honestly, I'd rather keep it that way. My name is Richard and I'm 45 years old. I live in a small house on the outskirts of Chicago. I've always been a skeptic, logical, practical. I'd never believed in things like ghosts or paranormal phenomena or anything that couldn't be explained by science. But there's something that happened to me a few months ago that has completely turned my world upside down. Something I can't explain, and it still haunts me to this day. I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there will understand. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I'd just gotten home from work, a pretty normal day, nothing out of the ordinary. I live alone, so the house is always quiet when I get back. I like it that way, peaceful. I set my things down on the kitchen counter and started to get dinner ready. The only light on in the house was the kitchen light, and everything felt comfortable, familiar. After eating, I was cleaning up when I noticed something strange. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow in the farthest corner of the living room. The corner is where I keep a small old wooden table that I had inherited from my grandmother. It's always been there, nothing special about it. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it at first, but as I turned off the kitchen light and began heading toward the living room to relax for the evening, I heard it. A soft whispering sound. Faint, but clear enough to catch my attention. I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't loud or alarming, but it was unmistakable, like voices, hushed, speaking rapidly. I glanced over at the table, thinking maybe it was the wind or the house creaking, but no. The whispering grew a little louder, though still muffled, as if coming from the table itself. My heart started pounding. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, if I was just exhausted, or if something was actually happening. I hesitated for a moment, but finally walked over to the table, cautiously. The whispers stopped as soon as I got close. I stared at the table for a moment, half expecting something to jump out at me. Nothing happened. Everything was still. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But that was only the beginning. Later that night, as I sat on the couch watching TV, I kept feeling a strange unease in the pit of my stomach. The thought of the table, the whispers, kept creeping into my mind. It was like there was a heavy presence in the room, something watching me. I couldn't explain it, but it was undeniable. I glanced over at the table again. It looked the same, old, wooden, empty. But then something caught my eye, a piece of paper. It was small and folded, tucked right under the edge of the table. I don't remember seeing it there earlier. I never keep papers on that table. Slowly, I walked over and picked it up. My hands were shaking a little as I unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, and the note read, "Don't turn on the light." I stood there in silence, staring at the note in my hands. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to make of it. Who left this here, and why? The note seemed wrong, like a warning. But from what? From who? I thought maybe it was a prank, but nothing made sense. I couldn't ignore it, though. The fear started creeping in, the sense that something was wrong, that something had been in that room long before I even noticed. I didn't know what to do, but I decided to leave the note where I found it. I wasn't ready to deal with it. I convinced myself it was just some weird coincidence. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I heard nothing, but the presence was there, heavy in the air. I tossed and turned, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to that note, to the whispers, to the table in the corner. The next day I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. Something had changed in the house. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed that strange energy, and now it was suffocating me. I couldn't relax in the living room anymore. Every time I walked into that room, I felt it, the same oppressive presence. That night, I decided I had to get to the bottom of it. I had to figure out what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight, turned off the lights, and walked back into the living room. The table was still in the corner, still empty, but I felt it. The voices, the whispering, soft, faint, but there. I shined the flashlight across the table, checking every inch, every corner. There was nothing unusual, but when I turned off the flashlight and stood there in the dark, I swear I heard a low murmur just beneath the surface of the silence. My pulse quickened. My hands trembled, but I couldn't look away. It was like I was drawn to it. Slowly, I turned the flashlight back on and scanned the table. Nothing was there. No note, no strange markings, but the air felt thick, like the room was holding its breath. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but I didn't see anything else. Eventually, I left the room, heart pounding, and tried to tell myself it was all in my head. But I knew it wasn't. I needed to understand. I couldn't keep living like this. Over the next few days, I did some research online. I searched for stories of similar experiences. I found a few, scattered here and there, about people hearing voices in their homes, strange occurrences around certain objects, but nothing that really explained what I was going through. No one could explain the whispering that came from the table, the note, or the strange feeling that something was lurking just beyond my reach. Then, a week later, I had a chance encounter at a local antique shop. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just browsing, but I couldn't help but notice an old table in the corner of the shop. It looked almost identical to mine. Same age, same style. I walked over to it, curiosity getting the better of me. I asked the shopkeeper if there was anything unusual about it, and he told me the table had been passed around for years. People who had owned it before had experienced strange things, voices, cold spots, the feeling of being watched. I didn't believe him at first, but as I stood there looking at that table, a sense of dread washed over me. It felt like the same table. I knew it wasn't, but the sensation was unmistakable. I hurried out of the store, feeling a knot in my stomach. That night, I didn't hear the whispers. There was no strange feeling in the air, but the unease lingered, and I knew I couldn't escape it. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if something truly strange was happening. All I knew was that I could never look at that corner the same way again. The table, the whispers, the note, it all felt wrong, like something had been triggered, but I couldn't explain it. I couldn't escape it. To this day, I don't hear the whispers anymore, but the feeling of being watched never left. I moved the table to the garage a few weeks ago, but I still feel that same oppressive presence when I walk into the room. It's as if it's waiting for me, waiting for the right moment to come back, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it. My name is Miles, I am 38 years old, and I live in Eugene, Oregon. What I am about to tell you happened about 5 years ago, and honestly, I still have no idea what I witnessed. Sometimes I think I was just tired, or my mind was playing tricks on me, but every time I think back to it, I feel that same strange shiver down my spine. I don't know if anyone here has gone through something like this, but if you have, you'll understand what I mean. At that time, I used to have lunch almost every day at a small diner, Benny's Diner. It was a pretty ordinary place, with those red leather booths and a jukebox that played 60s classics. The menu was basic, burgers, fries and milkshakes, but the food was good, cheap, and the place had that small-town charm. I worked nearby, so it was convenient. Plus, the waitstaff already knew me by name. and Benny, the owner, always made a point of greeting all the customers. It all started on a Tuesday. I remember this because it was the day the office always closed early, and I took the opportunity to go to Benny's and eat without rushing. I had ordered my usual burger and was fiddling with my phone while waiting. That's when I noticed something strange. The clock on the wall behind the counter, a retro one with a chrome frame, was going backward. I don't know if it was the ticking sound or the unexpected movement, but it caught my attention immediately. At first, I thought it was some sort of funny defect, and I even chuckled to myself. But when the waiter brought my order, I decided to ask about the clock. "Hey, is your clock broken? It's going backward." The guy looked at where I was pointing, gave me a confused look, and shook his head. "It's fine. It's normal." I thought he was joking with me, but he seemed sincere. I looked again, and to my surprise, the clock was functioning normally. The hands were moving forward, as they should. I shrugged it off and let it go. The following week, I returned to Benny's, and once again I noticed the clock. This time I barely stepped inside the diner when I saw it moving backward again. I stood there at the door for a few seconds, just watching. It couldn't be a coincidence. As soon as I sat down and looked again, the clock was normal. I started to think maybe it was just my imagination, but it stayed on my mind. There was something off about it. The weeks went by, and every time I was there, the clock did the same thing. It would start moving backward, but only when I looked directly at it. No one else seemed to notice. I asked the waitstaff a few more times, even tried recording it with my phone, but every time I pointed the camera, it stopped moving backward. I started paying closer attention to everything in the diner, looking for other strange things, but nothing else seemed out of place. It was just the clock. I became increasingly bothered by the situation. People around me were acting as if nothing strange was happening, and I began to question if I was going crazy. But that unsettling feeling never went away. The clock always seemed to move backward whenever I looked at it, like it was trying to show me something. Only I could see it, and the more I tried to make others notice, the more it seemed like they were in another world, completely unaware of what was going on. One day, I decided to face the situation head-on. I waited until the diner started to empty out, paid my bill, and before leaving, I stood in front of the counter, staring directly at the clock. It started moving backward again, and I felt a chill run down my spine. This time, the hands were moving faster than ever, almost like they were trying to show me something. My heart started racing, but I kept watching. I don't know how long I stood there, but suddenly I heard Benny's voice behind me. "Everything okay, Miles?" When I turned to answer, I almost knocked over my glass. Benny was staring at me, but he didn't seem the same. His expression had something off about it, almost vacant, as if he was disconnected. I asked, awkwardly, if he had noticed the clock moving backward. He laughed, but it was a dry laugh. "Clock, it's working fine as always." But when I looked back, the clock was no longer there. In its place was just a stain on the wall, as if it had never existed. I tried looking around, confused, but the diner was exactly the same as before. The jukebox was playing soft music, the waitstaff was serving customers as usual. I didn't know what to think. I thought I was going crazy. I left the diner that day with my mind racing. I decided I wouldn't go back there again, but to my surprise, the following week when I walked by, Benny's was closed. There was a sign saying the place was for rent. It was like the restaurant had vanished overnight. No one at work could explain it, and to this day, no one knows what happened. I tried searching online for anything about the diner, but I found almost nothing. It was as if it had never existed. What bothered me the most was that after so much time, I still couldn't forget it. I really wanted it to be just a nightmare or some illusion of my mind. But every time I pass by that spot, the feeling that something was wrong overtakes me again. The whole town doesn't seem to remember the diner, but I remember everything perfectly, as if it were yesterday. And the worst part is that, from time to time, I still see that same clock in other places. Not exactly the same, but always the same type, with the hands turning in the wrong direction. I know it's all in my head, but somehow it feels like it's more than that. The following months were tough. I tried to get back to my routine, but a strange feeling was always with me. At work, I started getting more distracted, more anxious. I couldn't stop thinking about that damn clock. The truth is, I wasn't able to tell if it was real or if it was a reflection of something deeper, something I didn't want to see. One night, after months of not thinking about it, I decided to pass by there once more. I wanted to finally understand what had happened. I reached the spot, and to my surprise, the for rent sign was still there, but something still bothered me. I walked up to the entrance and stopped for a moment, feeling the cold wind on my face. I didn't know what I expected to find. Everything seemed so ordinary, but at the same time so wrong. I tried to look into the diner, but for some reason, I couldn't go in. It was like some invisible force was pulling me away, keeping me from everything. That night, as I returned home, I finally accepted that I would never know what really happened in that diner. I never knew if it was a broken clock, if I was imagining everything, or if something much darker was at play. But since then, the clock still haunts my nightmares. I was never able to find answers, and the feeling that I'm being watched has never gone away. I don't know what happened that day, but I know I never want to see a clock on a wall the way I saw that one. Even if it's just a memory, every time I see something similar, that strange feeling begins to grow inside me, as if I'm getting closer to the truth, but at the same time, farther from any explanation.